Hello, my dear friends. We will continue the theme of premenopause and menopause. I'm Dr. Olena Berezovska, and I welcome you to my YouTube channel. If you look at the history of menopause, and this may surprise you because I have studied this topic very deeply, you will find that in the past, even the relatively recent past, women did not live long. For example, in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and Egypt several thousand years ago, average life expectancy was about 24-25 years. For men, it was slightly higher. It is therefore not surprising that the men often remarried or had several wives to produce an heir. Even when girls were married at 12, 13, or 14 years of age, they managed to give birth only a few times and often died very young, most commonly from complications during childbirth or after delivery because of the high prevalence of infections, famine, wars, and extreme living conditions. Sometimes even the heirs did not survive. Often there was only one surviving child, while several pregnancies ended in loss, and even those children did not always survive. That's why, for example, in ancient Greece there were laws allowing the adoption of children to pass on inheritance. Most often they were boys. Any man could adopt a child and transfer his inheritance if he had no biological children. Several thousand years later, by the beginning of the last century, the early 19th, the average life expectancy for women was only about 35-36 years. Most women did not even live to menopause. Most often, those who died were women who had been pregnant and given birth multiple times, again because of hemorrhage, complications, infections, and physical exhaustion. Interestingly, comparing living conditions between the aristocracy and rural areas shows that peasants and rural population often had slightly better survival conditions. They had fresh air and fresh food. Also, many experienced hunger. They were physically active. Overall, their living conditions were more favorable to longevity than those of people living in cold, damp stone houses or castles, often without bathing or basic hygiene. Ordinary people, by contrast, frequently bathed in rivers or lakes, even simply while washing clothes. In other words, they actually had better hygiene. But even these features from just over 100 years ago were, of course, horrifying. If you say to me, well, what about our grandmothers? Yes, there were indeed cases where women lived to 70 or even 80 years of age, as I mentioned earlier. But if we look at national statistics overall, such cases were rare. Perhaps we were fortunate that many of our own grandmothers and grandfathers lived to advanced old age. In my own family line, however, many relatives died before the age of 60, much early. So when we look at this long period of adaptation, of improving quality of life and increasing life expectancy, we must remember that millennia are an enormous span of time. This is not 2 or 3 generations, it's hundreds of generations. Yet, over the last 100 years, we have seen a dramatic leap in life expectancy. And in turn, we see how the period during which women enter menopause have changed. In the past, menopause usually occurred soon after the last major peak of reproductive function, around the age of 37-38, and this was considered normal. A little old woman at 40 was socially accepted concept. Of course, they were not actually older women, but it was considered normal for a woman to stop menstruating by age of 40. Later, this age began to rise as living condition, nutrition, and medical care improved, especially after World War II, with the introduction of antibiotics, vaccinations, and other advances. As a result, life expectancy increased significantly. Today, for example, in Europe and many other countries, Women live on average to about 80 years, and men live only 1 or 2 years less. In other words, a huge proportion of people now live to 80. I know several people in my own circle who are close to 90 or even older. For me, it has become normal to see such people, and they are very active, friendly, and not at all preparing to die. What does this tell us? It shows that life expectancy depends largely on living conditions, nutrition, and the level of medical care, rather than on genetics as such. This is important to understand, and life has given us this long period that women now live in menopause. If we had lived a century or more ago, most of us would have died between the age of 35 and 45. At least the majority would. In that case, we would not even be talking about menopause, and that is exactly how it was. Menopause as a topic entered discussion relatively recently. At some point, people suddenly noticed that menopause seemed to be occurring later. Previously, 37, 38 years was considered normal. Before World War II, and even shortly after it, 40 years was considered the dividing line between early and normal menopause. This was because it turned out that after the age of 40, within the following 5 years, almost 90% of women entered menopause. Therefore, no one said that menopause at 45 was early. On the contrary, anything after 40 was considered normal. This classification still exists in medicine today. So when someone tells me I'm 45 and I'm already in menopause, that's terrible, I say, no, in fact, this is still falls within the parameters of normal physiology. And for the transitional period, if my mother, for example, entered menopause around age 51, 52, then we, her daughters, would be expected to enter menopause approximately 1.5, 2 years later, which is also normal, provided there were no surgical intervention involving the ovaries. Thus, genes play only a limited role. There is also evidence suggesting that about 70% of menstrual patterns and related characteristics are influenced by genes we inherited from our mothers, but this is true only if there have been no interventions involving the ovaries, no endless laparoscopies, no fear-driven diagnosis of endometriosis, or no aggressive or repeated interference with ovarian function. In such cases, yes, we can to some extent predict the timing of menopause by comparing it with our mother's experience. What I want to emphasize is that this period has become significantly longer. Initially, menopause occurred around 37, 38 years of age. Today, in many countries, the average age at which women enter menopause is around 54. This shows that nature has given us a very long phase that we call premenopausal period. According to strict medical terminology, premenopause is defined as 3 years before menopause. I do not agree with this definition because in reality it is rather arbitrary, almost artificial, created to provide a formal point at which to label a woman as being in premenopause. I will continue my lecture on premenopause and menopause, so if you don't want to miss these videos, please subscribe to my channel.